In the city where Jane lived with her husband Brian, terrifying events began unfolding. News channels everywhere were reporting on a series of brutal murders that were terrorizing the town. This wasn't just another crime story, it was a nightmare. A maniac was abducting women and violently killing them, leaving behind not just lifeless bodies, but signs of unspeakable cruelty. At first, he would rape his victims, and only afterward would he inflict fatal wounds. The bodies were found in the most remote parts of the city, abandoned buildings, parks, and backyards. They were left as though the killer wanted everyone to see his success in this horrific, mysterious plan. It was almost impossible to fathom that such brutality could truly exist. The first victim was Mary Larson, a young woman found in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. Her skin was shredded, her body left in the most revolting state. As it turned out later, the maniac had raped her to death. Her hands and feet were bound with ropes, and her eyes were wide open in shock. The city trembled from these sinister details, but that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Each case grew more horrifying than the last. One by one, women began disappearing, wealthy, carefree, seemingly oblivious to the danger awaiting them. Within days, another victim vanished, Suzanne Grace. Again, the grisly details emerged, but this time, the news was even more graphic. When the police found her body in the woods, they discovered that the maniac hadn't just raped her, but also mutilated her body, leaving countless traces of his presence. The disfigured corpse seemed to echo its last scream into the darkness. It was a true nightmare. Each new crime was a dark stain on the souls of the city's residents. People began to fear walking outside late at night, locking their windows, and glancing nervously over their shoulders. Every look, every sound in the night was filled with fear and suspicion. Jane, like everyone else, started to feel this constant dread. She couldn't sleep peacefully anymore, hearing every rustle outside her window. Her thoughts often wandered to the news, where the latest victims were described. She imagined how these women must have died, their last screams and suffering, and each new case pulled her deeper into the darkness of the night. Brian, her husband, tried to reassure her. When Jane once again spoke about the maniac and her fear for her life, he took her hand and looked her in the eyes. "Don't worry, Jane," he said, gently holding her. "I'm with you. I'll always be by your side. Nothing's going to happen, I promise you. You're safe. I'll protect you." His words were warm and sincere, and Jane wanted to believe them. She had always felt that Brian was her rock, her protector. His love was like a refuge from the fear that consumed her daily. She listened to his voice, felt his touch, and tried to convince herself that everything would be okay. After all, Brian was her husband, her best friend, and she couldn't imagine anything ever happening to them. "I love you, Jane. You'll always be safe with me. No one will ever hurt us. I'll always be with you," he added, softly whispering as if trying to chase away the dark clouds. But even his comforting words couldn't distract her from the fear. Each day brought more news of the next victim of the maniac, and though Brian assured her that she had nothing to worry about, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that danger was already too close. She tried to calm herself, convincing herself that, with her husband, everything would be fine. He was strong, he was the one who was always there, supporting her. Time passed, but the horrifying news never left the city. One body after another was discovered in abandoned places. Each crime became more brutal, more deadly. The details were hard to ignore. Before killing his victims, the maniac would rape them and leave their bodies in places where help couldn't reach them. Only their bodies remained, a broken remnant of what was once a woman. This devastated the community, and the fear that had gripped the streets began to squeeze Jane's heart. But it wasn't just the fear from the killer that weighed on her heart. A few weeks after the last murder, Jane began to notice changes in Brian's behavior. At first, it was small things, quick bursts of anger over trivial matters. He might yell at her for missing a small detail or for not agreeing with him on something insignificant. This wasn't like him. He used to be patient and calm. Jane couldn't understand why he was acting this way, and it started to worry her. She tried to ask what was going on, but Brian would only respond in a cold, yet calm voice, saying, "It's just stress or it'll pass." However, facing his altered behavior, Jane felt like she was slowly losing her grip. But the worst part came when Brian began spending more and more time in the garage. They used to be close, and Jane always remembered how he hated cars. The garage was just a place for his tools, where he did small repairs on weekends. But now he would go out there every day and stay for hours. At first, it seemed odd to Jane, but over time, she started to worry. What could be making him spend so much time in there? She asked him, but he simply replied that perspectives change, and that he needed some time for himself. His answers became shorter, his gaze colder. He wasn't the open, caring man she knew anymore. Jane tried to force herself not to pay attention. She focused on her daily routine, keeping up with the house, following the news, and watching the terrifying images of women who had fallen victim to the maniac. All the details of the cruelty she learned about pierced her heart relentlessly. Every day, she felt more fear, sinking deeper into the thought that maybe something was wrong with her husband. Something dark was creeping into their home. When Brian was home, Jane tried to act normal, though her heart tightened with anxiety. She noticed how he began to grumble about small things. He might suddenly raise his voice or even shove her when they disagreed. This wasn't like him at all. More and more, she felt something dark was growing inside him. Brian started to belittle her with his words, though he used to be gentle and caring. She didn't understand how this had happened or why, but she felt the period of unpleasant changes was only getting worse. His aggression became more noticeable every day. Jane could no longer hide from the feeling that something truly evil had taken root in him. What happened to him? Was there a connection between his changes and what was happening in the city? She couldn't make sense of it. Fear began to seize her heart, and even his soothing words couldn't change that. What if her husband was the very maniac they were all searching for? Jane woke up with the same unsettling feeling of anxiety that had gripped her for weeks. That morning, as Brian left for work, she decided that today was the day. She had to find out what he was spending so much time doing in the garage. She could no longer ignore these suspicions. Something was wrong, and her fears wouldn't let her be. As soon as the door closed behind him, Jane quickly descended the stairs. She moved carefully, trying not to attract attention. In her hand was the spare key to the garage. Brian had often asked her to keep it in case he needed to come back later. Jane didn't quite understand why it felt so important, but she knew she had to do it. A single thought kept spinning in her mind. What if what he's hiding is more than just a habit? She sneaked through the backyard to the garage. It only took a little effort to open the door. As soon as she stepped inside, a chill swept over her. Not from the weather, but from the possibility of what she might find. The garage was filled with various tools, motor oil, and heavy metal objects. But there was something more than just tools. She slowly surveyed the space, scanning every corner. Under one of the work tables were rubber gloves stained with something dark. Probably not just regular dirt. Jane touched them, and her heart began to race. Further along on another shelf, she saw a few tools that looked unusual. They weren't meant for regular repairs. They resembled surgical instruments, though rusted from time. And then, amidst all these items, she noticed it. A small bracelet. Jane focused on it. It was made of tiny silver beads, simple yet with a certain elegance. It definitely wasn't hers. Her skin prickled with cold sweat. She couldn't remember who the bracelet belonged to, but she felt that it was important. It wasn't just a trinket. It was a clue, a sign of something bigger, something Brian was trying to conceal. Every movement seemed too loud in the stillness of the garage. She stood there, stunned, holding the bracelet in her hand, trying to understand what it all meant. She couldn't figure out what to do next. The bracelet was just a small thing, but the feeling it gave her was far more significant. What did it mean? How did this bracelet end up in the garage? When Jane returned to the kitchen, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence, but her heart wasn't so sure. Later that evening, when Brian came home, they sat down to dinner. She tried to act normal, keeping her composure, but her gaze kept drifting to the television. And then, the news, the same news that had been a constant in their lives these past few weeks. A young woman has gone missing again in the city. This is the 6th victim in the past few weeks. The police continue to investigate, but the trail goes cold, the reporter said. A photo flashed on the screen. It was Lauren Kitts, the sweet cashier at the local store near their house. She was smiling in the picture, dressed in a stylish dress, and she was wearing the same bracelet. That's where I've seen it before. Jane couldn't breathe, her gaze fixed on the screen. Her heart stopped. She saw that bracelet, the same one she had found in the garage. She couldn't believe her eyes. Her skin went cold with sweat. Her lips couldn't form a single word. What should she do? What if this isn't a coincidence? What if Brian is really involved in this? When Jane glanced at Brian, he was calmly chewing his dinner, unaware of her nervous expression. He had no idea that she was holding the echo of his secrets in her hand. Jane woke up with a heavy feeling, as if the world around her was trembling from the cold wind. She hadn't been able to sleep the night before. Every sound outside the window, every creak of the house felt like a sign that something terrible was approaching. It wasn't just a figment of her imagination or anxiety. All these signs, all these fears were something much bigger than she could ever have imagined. When Brian came home yesterday, he didn't seem like his usual self. His eyes were dull but held some strange, unreadable glimmer, like he was hiding something. Jane couldn't stop thinking about the bracelet on the girl from the news and the one she had found in the garage. She felt like her mind couldn't dismiss this as coincidence anymore. The next morning, during breakfast, she couldn't stay silent any longer. She no longer had the strength to play these games with herself. "Brian, why did you come home so late last night?" Her voice was firm, though her heart still trembled with nervousness. She saw a flicker of something change in his expression. They were sitting at the table, and the question hung in the air, tearing everything apart. And as soon as the words left her lips, he became someone else. His face twisted, and his deep gaze became so hard and cold that Jane felt her chest tighten with fear. "That's a stupid question. You shouldn't be asking things like that." His voice was sharp, and he nearly threw his plate at the wall. Jane flinched for a moment, but didn't look away. "Brian, things aren't the same anymore. You've changed, and I can't ignore it." His eyes narrowed, and a smile appeared on his lips, a smile that held no warmth. He grabbed her wrist, squeezing his fingers around it until her bones ached, and her breath caught. "Do you want to lose me?" "These are stupid questions, Jane. Don't ask them again." At his words, she froze. Brian immediately let go of her hand and, without looking at her, left the room. Jane sat at the table, deaf to everything around her, her mind unable to process what had just happened. Fear and anxiety gripped her, but she still couldn't believe that her husband could be a psychopath. She tried to find excuses for his behavior. Maybe he was tired, maybe he had a rough day at work, maybe it was just a temporary mood shift. But her heart wasn't wrong. This wasn't just a change. This was a sign that something terrible was about to tear her world apart. To distract herself from the thoughts, Jane decided to tackle some chores. She went into the laundry room. All these little routine tasks once seemed so simple, so safe. But now, every movement felt like walking on the edge of a knife. As she pulled clothes out of the basket, her eyes stopped on Brian's shirt. And right there, under the fluorescent light of the laundry room, she saw something that made her freeze. On the collar of his shirt were stains she had initially mistaken for a simple spill. But upon closer inspection, her heart raced. It wasn't just a stain, it was blood. A thin line of red liquid stretched across the fabric, like a dirty trail that couldn't be wiped away. Jane held the shirt in her hands, her fingers trembling, and she felt the dark stains of fear seep into her heart. She couldn't ignore this anymore. Everything she had tried to explain away, everything that seemed like coincidence, now became an undeniable truth. She remembered that night in the garage, rubber gloves, strange tools, the bracelet, and now this blood. Blood that likely belonged to his victims. Her husband was a psychopath, and now she knew it. A silence filled her heart, but it wasn't the kind that brings relief. It was the silence before the storm. She couldn't stand still anymore. She had to act. But as Jane looked at the bloodstains, her perception of everything around her changed forever. Jane stood in the middle of the room, her heart pounding in her chest like a frantic drumbeat. She was quickly packing her things, her hands trembling with fear and despair. She had to leave before he came home. None of this mattered anymore. Her life with Brian was nothing but a nightmare that had dragged on for far too long, and she could no longer stay in this house with this monster. She was almost out the door when suddenly the sound of a car engine reached her ears. She froze. Her heart skipped a beat. It was him. Brian was home. As she opened the door, she saw him. His face was pale, his eyes cold and filled with hatred. He walked straight toward her, stopping just a step away, his expression lifeless as he asked, "What are you doing?" Her lips were dry, and her head throbbed from the tension, but she answered without hesitation. "I know what you've done. I can't live with a monster like you anymore. I've already called the police. They'll be here soon." Those words were the final blow that shattered whatever was left of his sanity. His eyes narrowed, turning red as blood, and a grotesque smile twisted his face. A smile that meant nothing but ruthless aggression. He began to approach, his footsteps heavy, like blows from a hammer. Jane tried to back away, but he was already too close. "You think I'm afraid of the police?" he growled, his voice low and guttural. Suddenly, his hand shot out and grabbed her by the neck, his cold fingers digging into her skin. Brian slammed her against the wall, and Jane felt the pressure on her lungs. Darkness clouded her vision, but she fought to stay conscious. She couldn't give up. She tried to break free, but he tightened his grip. Panic filled her eyes, and her chest struggled for that last painful breath. She tried to scream, but his hand choked off any sound, leaving her without a chance. He wasn't just choking her. He was relishing every moment of her struggle, and she could see the satisfaction on his face as he watched her suffer. Then suddenly he released her. She tried to get up, but everything was spinning. Her body no longer obeyed her commands, and then he grabbed a knife. Every movement was precise, without a shred of mercy. First, he slashed her arm, deep and painful, and she felt the hot blood pour down her fingers. In agony, Jane attempted to move, to find a place to hide, but he was too fast. And then he threw her to the floor, stepping on her chest. Her eyes reflected her last moments of life. She could no longer fight. Blood filled her mouth, and everything went black. He didn't stop. She no longer screamed. Her consciousness sank into the darkness, and with her last breath, her body lay lifeless on the floor. Brian left her at the crime scene, quickly fleeing the house without a glance back. His feet never slowed. He left no trace, as if he were a shadow that vanished into the night. The police arrived late, an hour after everything had transpired. They found only Jane, brutally murdered, and a note on the table with her final words, carrying all her hopelessness and despair. "I know who you really are. You're a killer, a maniac. Open your eyes, Brian, but I won't be a part of your games anymore. I'm leaving, and you'll never find me." But Brian, like his shadow, was already far away, and despite all the blood and pain, no one could find him. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the story. What do you think? Could Jane have done something differently? And remember, sometimes facing the truth is the hardest part, but having the courage to confront it is the first step towards breaking free and reclaiming control over your life.